So for your plain seams or your plain seam, you need 2 fabrics to be sewn together to achieve a straight and a plain seam. For you to be able to do that, you need to ensure that your fabrics are placed together like right sides facing each other like this, and then you're going to sew on the wrong side of the fabric. Ensure that they are placed together this way, and you can also help yourself by pinning this way to stabilize your fabric. It's important to pin your fabrics together before you sew. Once you get a hang of it, then you can sew without having to pin some of your fabrics together, but get used to pinning. It is very, very good. So this is it. Another thing to do is to make sure that you sew exactly where you want to, is to mark out the seam allowance for that plain seam. Say for instance you want to sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can use your tailor's chalk to mark out that seam allowance that you're going to be stitching on, so that you can follow the line as you stitch. Remember that you've learned how to sew straight lines. Now it's time to practice it by sewing a plain seam. We are making a plain seam. So once you have this, you can connect those dots with your chalk so that you can see it properly. Yeah, and then go ahead to stitch it on your machine. Place your fabric again on your sewing machine with your foot up, then bring your foot down. Use your wheel to ensure that your needle is right on the line you want to start stitching on. Once you have that, then you can start sewing. Make sure you reverse or back stitch. You can remove your pins as you sew. This way you don't need to remove your pins if your pins are good and slender, but if they are quite big, you may need to remove them. Or if you get to pin this way, some people pin this way, I pin both ways, you understand, but you can stitch while you sew if you pin this way and if your pins are slender. But if they are not so tiny, just so you don't break your needle, you can actually remove your pins as you sew. Just going to take it out. Take it out. Make sure that your fabric is well positioned and you are guiding it gently, 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 gently. And when I get to when I'm very close to the other edge of my fabric, I'm going to back stitch, raise my foot pedal, use my wheel to release my fabric by rolling it back and forth. You can see diagonally, and then go ahead to cut. This is your plain seam. This is your plain seam. and you can see that it is straight and it is exactly half of an inch for your sewing allowance. What you want to do next is open it up, you press this way. So I'm going to open my seams to press it. Press it flat and nice. Make sure not to use this thread. I'm using this thread so you can see exactly what I'm doing. Use the exact color of thread for your seam. Open it on the other side, which is the right side, and press as well. Here we go, a nice and lovely plain seam. This is what you use to make your skirts and basically for garment construction. The foundation for your sewing is your plain seam. For your curved seam, get your two pieces of fabric together and then try to make a curve out of it. You can use your chalk to just draw a curve. Let me fold it this way so it's much easier. Let me leave it like that. Now I'm going to use my scissors to create a curve because I want to sew in the curved seam. You can make your fabric much bigger or wider so that you have enough curves to work with, but I'm just trying to give you an illustration of what the curved seam is usually like. It's just something that's curved. You can see these edges are quite curved, so we're going to try to stitch around that. Then again, you can mark your seam allowance, say half an inch seam allowance, half an inch. You try to mark it all the way. Every part that you're going to stitch, just mark your half of an inch sewing allowance to on your fabric rather. This with your chalk, do it all the way till you get to the other end of your fabric. You can also connect that line, connect it to your chalk, connect it till you get to the end. So what I'm going to do is also use my pin again to stabilize my two fabrics together. Remember, right sides are going to face each other and then we are going to stitch just right on the wrong side of the fabric. Use your pins to stabilize and ensure that both pieces of fabrics are lined together, not one like this and the other one the other way. They should be placed together as you prepare your fabric to be stitched. So I'll go right to my sewing machine again and then try to stitch around the curve. From one end, I'm going to stitch my fabrics. First of all, roll my wheel to ensure that it's just right on the parts that I have marked with my chalk, and then reverse. Gradually, I'm going to maneuver my fabric gradually. Can you see the way I'm turning my hand? I'm trying to ensure that I continuously stitch on that curved line that I have marked. Can you see the way my fabric has moved from here to here? That's what you want to try to do. And you go all the way, and then you get to another curved part. You try to turn your fabric gradually till you get to the other end of your fabric. Then you backstitch or you reverse. Raise your foot pedal. Use your wheel to release the fabric. Draw it a little bit diagonally. Leave enough thread allowance before you cut. Trim off the edge of both sides, and then we have our curved seam. And then another thing you need to do with your curved seam is a technique I call clipping. Now you're going to use your scissors to clip your seam. Do not clip this not your seam, your fabric. Make sure that your scissors doesn't get to your seam. If not, you'll have to restitch that part and it can be messy. So just clip close to your seam, but not through your seam. There, clip. The reason why you're doing this is because it's a curve, and you need this part to properly sit well. If I turn this fabric right side out, you would notice that the edges are not properly sitting well, and you have a lot of bulk inside the fabric. You can see the edges, but once I clip, I get to that part where I have my curve, and clip it very well, just to, as in, not leaving too much space. I clip it closely like this. It will help reduce the bulk at the edge of the fabric. But when I get to this part that's not as curved, I can space it. And once I get to this other side, I clip it again, ensuring that I don't clip my seam away. I'm going to do that closely at this curved part, and then go ahead to, I have something like this. Also, you can reduce the bulk of the fabric. If you notice that you have too much bulk, before clipping you can actually cut it, reduce the bulk this way. Reduce the bulk, reduce it, just so that you have something flat when you fold your seam. If you open it up, you have something like this as your curved seam. Can you see that it's curved? Now when you want to press, you must ensure that you press with both seams like this together. They have to be on top of each other and align like that while you press. You don't want one folding to one side and the other side one folding to the other side. They have to be together, and then you can go ahead to press. Can you see it's much better than before? Because I have clipped and I have reduced the bulb, I have something much better. So I'm just going to do this press, ensuring that they are aligned. Ensuring that each sides are aligned properly. And there we have it. We've created a curved seam. This is the first fabric we joined, and this is the second fabric that we joined to this first fabric. This is the right side, beautifully done, and this is the left side. And you see the curves. And that's it. We have a nicely sewn curved seam with nice edges. The next thing I'm going to be showing you now is the French seam. The French seam is quite different from other seams, and the reason why is because you're going to be stitching twice. Now the first stitch you're going to make, you're going to have to sew on the right side of your fabric first, not the wrong side. You know, the previous seams we were sewing on the wrong side of the fabric instead of the right side, but for your French seam you have to sew first on the right side of your fabric. And when you're sewing that, you're not going to sew too much, giving too much of your sewing allowance, taking too much sewing allowance. You just need a little, like maybe like a 1/4 of an inch or 2/8. You can mark that with your tailor's chalk again, using 2/8 of for your seam or your sewing allowance. I'm going to just connect that down with each other, right? So this is me sewing on the right side, first of my fabric. Right side will be stitched first, don't forget. As you can see, I have stabilized my fabrics with my pins. I'm going to go ahead now to stitch on the fabric. Make sure that, okay, just take out your pins as you sew. This is not allowing me sew with the pins. I'm going to release my fabric again by rolling my wheel back and forth and leaving enough allowance for my thread. So you have a seam. This would need to be corrected. Just give me a little. So I've made my first seam. What I'm going to do next is reduce the bulk by trimming very close to that seam, ensuring that I don't cut through the seam, but I'm trimming just like 1/8 closer to the seam, and you have something like this. The next thing I'm going to do is now stitch on the wrong side of my fabric. So what I'm going to do is open it up and then fold it this way and go ahead to stitch on the wrong side. You can actually pin once you've stitched it. You're going to conceal the former stitch that was on the right side. You're going to conceal that stitch and you would have a clean finish and a French seam made. Next off, I'll take this fabric to my sewing machine and then stitch. You can use your chalk to mark your seam allowance, which is usually like 1/2 inch. And back stitch, remove my pins as I sew and try to sew with my 1/2 inch sewing allowance. Another way that I can watch if I'm actually sewing 1/2 inch or if my stitch is straight is ensuring that this fabric here is aligning with this line, which is a seam guide. This is a seam guide. It's a line that helps you measure the sewing or the seam allowance. So if my fabric is aligning while I stitch, then I'm on track. But if it's going off course, then I may need to pause, adjust my fabric and ensure that I guide it to be, you know, to follow this line, this seam guide as I sew. Every machine has a seam guide. You can check your manual to see how you can benefit from using it for your sewing. At the end of it, I'm going to back stitch and raise my foot pedal, use my wheel to release my fabric and then cut. So we have our right side neatly finished and the inner part of our seam has been stitched. If you look at the edge properly, you will notice that this was the first seam that was done on the right side of the fabric. So if you don't have a serger or overlockers, especially for those lightweight fabrics like I mentioned, then you can use this French seam to finish off those kinds of fabric. What you're going to do next is use your iron to press this part of your seam and ensure that they align while you press, and that is it for your French seam. This is the back and this is the front. which is the right side of your fabric. This is what it should look like. Finally going to just give it a little press just at that edge that I mentioned. Just at that edge, just a little press so that it's nice and flat. And remember, it's important to press on the go. Once you make your seams, or you sew your seams, try to press them neatly. And that's it. Once you've learned how to sew your straight seams, you want to practice how to, sew folded seams. It's pretty easy. You don't need too much. You don't need to stress yourself too much. You just need to know the techniques to use to do your folding with ease. I'm just going to trim off this threads, cut it off a little bit before I start my folding. So what you need to do first is work with folding towards the wrong side of your fabric. Now this other side is the right side of my fabric, but I'm going to be folding towards the wrong side of my fabric. Now while I fold, I would make sure that I do my first folding once and then fold it the second time. You do it once like this and then fold again the second time. Now if you're not a beginner, you can do this while you sew, but for beginners it might be a little tricky to sew while you fold. So I would advise that you stabilize your fabric with some nice sharp pins. This way you would have it in place as you stitch. So I'm just going to fold and pin, fold and pin, fold, and pin. Now you're going to do this as all the way till you get to the end of the part where you're done sewing. This would help you sew perfectly without having to worry about doing two things at the same time. As you perfect your sewing skills, you would be able to stitch or fold and stitch on the go. So you can see that the fabric is already pinned in place, and all I'm going to do now is to go to my sewing machine and stitch. So I have pinned my fabric in place. I'm going to start sewing. Now this is the fun part. I raise my zipper presser foot, put my fabric down in place, and then I start. So try to stitch as close to the edge as possible. So you want to make sure that your stitches are quite close to this edge of your fabric. That is what you need to target. Try to stitch just close to the edge. Now you don't have to rush this exercise, just take your time, but ensure that your needle stitches just close to the edge, not away from the edge, not in between the edge. You would need to do this by using your hands to guide the fabric, not pull. Don't pull. You have the tendency to want to drag while you sew. Try to just hold it softly, but guide it to the point where your needle stitches just on the edge. If you find out that you're maybe going or straying away, you can stop, try to unpick the seams that don't look straight, and then start from where you started off right. You can also raise your foot pedal to adjust your fabric so that it stays in place as you sew. Don't worry. All you need to do is to practice this. As long as you have your pins, it's going to be easy for you to walk around stitching it. So try to guide your fabric. Don't forget, guide your fabric as you sew, and work towards stitching close to the tip of this fold. That way you will have a nice and neat finish. Now when you get to the other side, make sure that you back stitch, and that is it. Raise up your foot pedal, use your wheel to release your fabric, and then cut off that thread, and then you have something like this. Can you see that it's properly folded on towards the wrong side, and now this is what you have on the right side. I hope you found this useful. Please make sure to give this a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.